Hello. I'd like to take a look at the topic of whether we need more emphasis in society on providing help for the so-called mentally ill, those so-called struggling emotionally or financially, or do we need more focus on social justice in order to help people suffer less emotionally and financially? Or thirdly, do we need the Buddhist approach, which says acceptance of whatever, without, again, emphasis on social justice, social advancement, more rights in certain respects to some people? Well, I think this is an important question. For consider the approach of so-called mental health assistance being one of two types. In the past, therapy or psychoanalysis, and in the past 20 or 30 years, mostly the drug approach, based on the newer premise that there's generally a hugely proportionate biochemical situation going on, genetics being almost the entire picture they claim. But at any rate, the point being that there's almost no emphasis by the psychiatric profession then on social justice to remedy emotional pain, but instead a total emphasis on one's chemical mindset. There being almost no discussion at all in psychiatry of overcrowding, urban life, inadequate income in general, and other issues, which are matters more of social justice than your biochemistry. So, indeed, of course, issues regarding overcrowding being much more solvable, at least in the short term, by administering drugs to dull the mind of those afflicted than to correct the problems with social justice applications, even to include issues of overpopulation in general and over-industrialization. So, another interest of mine in this whole avenue is formerly the application of therapy to try and address emotional stress. But I've seen several people, in fact, claim that if you just straighten out your so-called stinking thinking, your cognitive errors, so to speak, your poor logic skills in your mind, that all your emotional distress would go away. This being especially the contention starting with the cognitive behaviorists Aaron Beck and rational emotive therapy, Albert Ellis, and Dr. David D. Burns, who posited these ideas too, popularized it, in fact, through his books like Feeling Good and the Feeling Good Handbook, whereby the contention is that if you simply straightened out your cognitive errors, your bad thinking, your depression and all other forms of emotional suffering would go away, including supposedly all of that caused by overcrowding, poor housing, terrible jobs, minimum wage, no pensions, and of course the ubiquitous housewife, very unhappy, and possibly enduring quite a bit of physical stress, if you know what I mean, from her husband at times. how is cognitive restructuring of our minds supposed to take care of much of this? Maybe it can in rare instances, but the point being that social justice reforms and reforms to marriage laws, etc., could probably help a lot more, at least in the long term. Although in the short term, administering of pills and claiming that they're being given out for mental illness is perhaps a short-term solution, more expedient in the short term, but not the long term. Let alone, of course, the impact on those receiving the drugs, to their self-esteem and the dulling of their minds, and impact on their economics and ability to get good jobs, social stigma, etc. In the modern times, I see a few people talking about this application of correcting your thinking instead of pushing social justice. I see it coming particularly from those of the Eastern Buddhist perspective, in one form or another, whereby it's urged that we either correct our thinking or adapt more acceptance of what is. But here's the rub. If this were easily possible, why wouldn't we all be doing it, or why wouldn't therapy be working? Why wouldn't the cognitive therapy approach, in fact, be a big-time means of addressing all sorts of things instead of drugs, psychiatric drugs? Again, also regarding hardcore addicts and alcoholics who go to rehab. Do you really think they come out addiction-free as a result of cognitive behavioral therapy? I don't think so. This, of course, being part and parcel of videos put out by Russell Brand in England, who has complained bitterly, in fact, that those going to rehab almost inevitably come out with a new addiction called a methadone addiction. And he would like to see, of course, this go by the wayside and people be on their own with clearer minds and less stigma by having overcame the issues. But how do you overcome them cognitively with so-called cognitive therapy if that's a drop in the bucket approach to overcome issues of lack of social justice with regard to good housing, good jobs, meaningful jobs, and jobs that don't require a colossal amount of time each day, that strip us of our relationships after work, leave us highly stressed, and too little time in general for self-growth, learning, exploring, enjoying life. These are all questions I bring up. Now there have been examples of those who seem to be able to pull off this cognitive restructuring. I give you, for instance, Einstein, a very magnanimous man, not just scientifically but emotionally, having led a vanguard against Hitler, for instance, as a world leader for rights, peace, etc. Now, how many people can pull off that kind of thing without his intellectual genius and the amount of time he had on hand in general? Whereby, how many people know that Einstein basically worked 18 hours a day on relativity, 7 days a week for 20 years before he came up with the solution? Arguably putting in quite a bit of time, way beyond most, on matters of social justice against Hitler, too. Or what of the dissident in Russia, Andrei Sakharov? He was a physicist, a brilliant one probably. What about Edison, who said that genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, and whose claim to fame, amongst others, was the light bulb, some of whom say only came into being after he tried over 1,000 filaments before one worked in the light bulb. But again, it taking a genius and a man with an incredible amount of time on hands to do this. Finally, I would mention several others too. The famed Buddhist Pema Chodron, revered by many in Buddhist circles. But how many know that before she was a nun, she was once married and went to Berkeley University, arguably one of the finest colleges in the whole world? If she had not had that level of intellect, could she have developed into the person of such magnanimous character and insight to be one of the leading Buddhists today? And finally, the philosopher Nietzsche, who once said a very interesting phrase: "A married philosopher is a joke." And he was, by the way, not married. The whole point being, in his mind, that if you're married, you don't have the time required to develop as a philosopher of noteworthiness. So again, all these famed people, either intellectually, emotionally, or in terms of social justice, having had a colossal amount of time on hand and a colossal drive and colossal intellect. So you could say, for these people, they achieved wonderful levels, high levels of emotional stability and happiness, but only because they had tons of time and huge dollops of intellect, possibly partly genetic in nature, accorded them. But what of the average man, who can't pull this off and can't find a great therapist to help him pull it off? Then he can't restructure his mind, do his own cognitive therapy, his own self-psychoanalysis of his own mind. What then? Well, I would maintain then an alternative is the alternative of more social justice, to relieve some of the stressors on us that some are saying should be corrected with cognitive therapy or mind restructuring. But if you don't have the intellect to do that, or can't get the proper help, it arguably even not existing, except in a few people in the whole world, then isn't social justice the best option? Instead of drugging people to death, muting their minds. I put this out as food for thought. Naturally, the whole concept of social justice has many aspects and can be unfortunately applied very militantly and very much in a manner of attitude of superiority and grandiosity. But still, the concept of strengthening our rights in certain ways being to me of the utmost importance, especially if one isn't a super genius with lots of time on one's hands to help deal with emotions in any other fashion. Otherwise, why would we even have lawyers? Why would we even have laws? Why would we even have jails if there weren't a need for social justice? Why wouldn't we just say, let anyone do anything to you that they feel like, and you should just either take a pill or go get some cognitive therapy to straighten out your stinking thinking that makes you feel bad about it. Naturally, that's kind of a ridiculous idea, I think. That's why we have laws. Laws being a form of social justice. I would simply say that, in my mind, let's not have more laws, but take more of a look at what our basic needs are, or rather our basic rights are, and strengthen those, as opposed to more social justice in terms of more laws. But the laws not addressing our certain, quote, inalienable rights. I wish you well. Food for thought.